I'm your sedative.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is Paul Kautza. I'm the Director of Education for the Data Warehousing Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our Orlando conference. I'm glad you all were able to make it. Just a show of hands, how many of you, is this your first TDWI conference? Now, how many of you have been here multiple times? Every one of you, keep your hands up. Every one of you that has this your first time, look at the faces around you that have their hands up. Seek these people out a little bit too, and I want you guys to, not only with these guys, but with people at your table, with people around you, use this not just from a classroom education standpoint, but from a networking standpoint. I'm sure that there isn't a problem that you have that somebody in this room doesn't have the same problem or hasn't figured out how to solve it. So this is a great education opportunity, but it's also a great networking opportunity. You've got a lot of opportunities to network, a lot of opportunities to talk to each other. Tomorrow and Wednesday, you'll have plenty of time at the exhibit hall for networking and lunches. We have some evening receptions, some different things going on. So please utilize the time outside of the classroom for networking and building relationships that you guys can keep going and help solve your business problems as you move forward. So there's a lot of people in this room. There's a lot of knowledge in this room. A couple of housekeeping things. We started this morning at 8 with a keynote. Guess what? We start at 8 tomorrow morning, but they're in the classrooms. Okay, so we've got a long day tomorrow, so classes start at 8 a.m. The breakfast will be in the atrium back by the reception area. On the other side of the reception area will be breakfast tomorrow morning. The exhibit hall is open tomorrow, lunch, evening, and Wednesday lunch. So just remember classes at 8 tomorrow. And with that, I want to introduce this morning's keynote, Marc Demarest. Marc is the CEO and principal at Noumenal, an international management consulting firm based in the Pacific Northwest that provides management and technology consulting services. Marc has been in the BI business since 1991 and is widely known as an early proponent of data marting and tiered enterprise data warehousing models. He is considered an expert in big data, sensor networks, and real-time streaming analysis. Today, Marc's going to spend a little time walking us through some of Noumenal's predictions on where corporations are going to invest in the future and talking about expected shifts in DWBI in the analytics markets. So with that, I give you Marc Demarest.
Morning, everybody. It's my job to give you a little bit of prognostication with your scrambled eggs this morning, so I'll endeavor to be a little bit controversial. At least everybody will get woken up, if nothing else. So where do I point? I think I killed... Oh, I did it backwards. There we go. Forecasting. So once upon a time, the market analysts in our industry actually produced forecasts. Does anybody remember this period? Let me see a show of hands. We used to be able to get documents from market forecasters that said things like, token ring will outsell Ethernet by 2 to 1 in 1998. Probability equals 0.6. Anybody remember these? No? God, I'm really dating myself, aren't I? What was really interesting about these prognostications was that they took them very seriously. Not only did we pay to get these documents, but if you went to visit the headquarters of these market analysts, you would find these prognostications in frames, all in the public lobby areas. They were tracking their own projections to see how well they did. And sometime circa 2001, the practice just stopped. It didn't gradually tail off. It just stopped. The same service you bought last year with P equals 0.7 disappeared from the landscape. And I had the opportunity to talk to one of the SVPs from one of the marketing firms about why that had happened. And he said, well, you know, the problem is we were mostly wrong. And his position, and I think it was a good one, was that they were prognosticating, they were forecasting purely bite-level technology trends. They were too granular. They weren't part of a bigger model. You know, Drucker's notion that forecasting or projection is like trying to drive down a country road at night with no lights while looking out the back window is a pretty accurate notion. We don't do a very good job of building large-scale predictive models. And when we do, we simply change the terms of the debate. We stop talking about the outcome of the model and start talking about how the model was built. As, for example, we did a lot in this most recent election. Forecasts like the weather allow us to predict with a pretty high degree of probability what's going to happen in the next 5 days, and with very low probability about what will happen after that. And so in the early part of this century, people began to do something different, something they called scenario planning. It came out of the oil and gas industry, which if any of you work in that industry, you know it's extraordinarily important to have very long-term views about what is going to happen in the very complex social systems that circle around the oil and gas industry that have to do with things as apparently diverse as consumer spending and industrial production. Scenario planning is a method for learning about the future by understanding the nature and impact of the most uncertain and important driving forces affecting our world. The goal is to craft a number of diverging stories by extrapolating uncertain and heavily influenced driving forces. Now, at Noumenal, we have to do this for our clients, and we maintain a very large set of scenarios, many of them covering topics you guys don't care about. What's the likely future state of the analog sensor market? Will internet-connected high-definition display devices grow, decline, or be absorbed? And like everybody else, many of the scenarios that we decide are the likely dominant ones turn out not to be true. We don't measure ourselves because the objective isn't to prove that you're right, because we have to deal with this problem in markets that's known as reflexivity. In a market where signals arise primarily from the actions of other players, any dominant narrative about the future state of the market is likely to be accurate. Now, this is an idea that was first promulgated by George Soros, perhaps the most famous financier on the face of the planet, who used this model to corner the British pound, among other things. And his point is that markets work by means of storytelling, and when market actors tell each other stories, the story that emerges as the dominant one turns out to be true. So if we tell ourselves a story about the market, we tend to bring it into being. So today I'm going to tell you a few stories about our market, the data warehousing and business intelligence marketplace. You will decide, I think, whether it is a story that makes sense to you. The goal isn't to be right. The goal is to have a narrative that, in your case, is broadly shared among members of your organization about the likely future state of your business and the BI, DW infrastructure in your business, because stories allow you to norm and form. The interesting thing about our stories is we used to tell entirely technical stories. Token ring will eclipse Ethernet. Increasingly, the stories that I hear us telling each other in forums like this are sociotechnical stories. Instead of just talking about coal mining equipment, we are increasingly talking about the behavior of coal miners, about the human element and the way in which the human element affects our technological deployments. Anybody here currently wrestling with how to adapt your BI infrastructure for the bring your own desktop movement? No? One person, awesome. Maybe you're the leading edge. The notion that knowledge workers would bring their own technology into the corporate IT infrastructure and then demand that the infrastructure support it is one that 10 years ago was quite literally unthinkable. No one talked about it. Today, We see it all the time, but if this is a representative sample, very few of us are actually wrestling with that problem. Will more of us wrestle with it in the future? I don't know, but one thing's for sure, some of the dominant narratives we're gonna have to deal with in the next 5 years have less to do with technology than they do with human beings and the way they behave, both in individual and in aggregate. Because we're in a period of disequilibrium. Who here believes that their working environment is more stable now than it was 3 years ago? Yeah, that's the answer for everyone. We are in a period of whitewater after 5 or 6 years of relatively stable technology development, relatively stable economics. We are going through a period of punctuation in which the level of disequilibrium is high, and in those periods, social practices tend to lag technology. Technology can do things, can enable things that we are not ready to contemplate socially. And at least one of the stories that I'll tell you today has to do with just that sort of problem. So what am I going to talk about? A bunch of stories that we internally in Noumenal refer to as spitballing stories. Why do we call them spitballing? Well, there's kind of a triple entendre there. Part of it has to do with spitballs versus crystal balls, and another part of it has to do with that kind of wanton free play that you saw around the cafeteria table when you were in grade school. What happens when you give a lot of small boys plastic straws? So the first one I'm going to talk to you about is the big data story. In our view, we are going to discover that the big data revolution is additive, that merging data scientists and information consumers into our current infrastructure is a recipe for disaster, and that what we're going to see happen architecturally over the next 10 years, because it will take that long, is the enterprise data warehousing infrastructure with the layers of dependent marts that many of us have built is going to prove to be a very effective information distribution environment, but not a very effective environment for information exploration and for discovery of the key element in the new data warehousing model, which is those algorithms that make very large volumes of data make sense. Sense making is going to become a big problem for all of us. And that new infrastructure is going to essentially surround the warehouse, top and side from an architectural perspective, and produce an environment in which many things that today we would think of as being done in the warehouse are actually done in what we refer to internally as the data pool. And the warehousing environment, while it continues to absorb data from many of the traditional sources that we have integrated with today, is now the recipient of information from that pool. Data is promoted from the pool into the warehouse. The results of data scientists' activities in that pool are published into the warehouse, either as outcomes or as algorithms that run close to the data in the warehouse. But perhaps most importantly, in that pool, a whole new silo of analytical technologies, various sorts of appliances arise. And those appliances are not transitional mechanisms. They're not something we use until the enterprise warehouse can actually do the work. They become fixtures of our IT landscape. We are going back to the future, back to an environment in which we have to deal with a large number of information silos. We'll still have this information distribution infrastructure that many of us have spent the last 10 years of our lives building for our customers, but it becomes one silo among many, and this is something that should cause all of you to think, as an established piece of the IT infrastructure, it becomes, from the business's perspective, a source of cost rather than a source of presumed value. And we all know what that means. That means people in our organization are going to be looking to figure out how to down cost information distribution, either as part of a larger effort to improve profitability or as a mechanism for shifting resources from information distribution to what is perceived as being the new, exciting, and more valuable component of this infrastructure, the data pool. Second story, also important to us from a technological perspective. We believe that the current analytics market has run its course. If you think about the way in which BI applications were written circa 2000, the vast majority of the code weight in those applications had to do with complexity of access, getting the data out of the place it was in, followed by making it look pretty on the front end. And in the middle, there was an unimaginably thin layer that might have actually added some kind of analytical value in the true computational sense of that term. But for the most part, these applications had two components: get it out, put it on the screen. Right now, complexity of access is becoming an uninteresting problem. It is easier to get it out than it ever has been, and largely because of, I would argue, our failure collectively to educate our business partners. Make pretty has become the dominant set of decision-making criteria for building out a BI infrastructure. How pretty does it look on the screen? We think that by 2020, complexity of access and complexity of integration are going to be a problem again, because we have moved back to a siloed environment, because in some cases, the data we're going after does not even exist inside our firewall. It lives in the cloud, as we like to say. And that for the most part, making pretty is going to be something which is done elsewhere, outside the BI infrastructure, if it's done at all. Analytics gets fat. Many of the things which are explored, prototyped, and pioneered in the data pool turn out to be of high value to the business, are migrated into the information distribution environment, but that in many cases, the output of an algorithm is not a pie chart on a screen for eyeballs to look at. It's actually an integration with a production system. This is going to fundamentally change, I think, how many of us view our role in the organizations we work in. Third big story, the rise of relational text. This is a controversial story. If my colleague Mark Madsen was here, he could expound at length about just how wrong I am about this particular topic. But we all know that the growth in raw data is coming largely from what we call unstructured data. Industry-wide, relational data sources in the corporation are growing relatively slowly, sort of 10 to 15%. Unstructured data is growing by a percentage that is at least an order of magnitude larger. But there really isn't any such thing as unstructured data. What we really mean is the growth is coming from textual data. And the reason why it's growing is because elsewhere, our programming practices have become extraordinarily sloppy. In places where we used to store a byte or a hex code or a short string, we now put up a text field and let people type in just any old thing. Why? Because it's cheap to store and it's cheap to process, and we're all about putting up applications fast. The explosion does have a lot to do with programming practices, and it also has a lot to do with the fact that people do not express themselves in byte codes or in hex. They use natural language. Textual data is always structured by the language in which it is produced. Now, we don't today deal with this fact. What we do instead is to say, look, it's too hard to parse the language. It's too hard to understand what that string is actually trying to express. So let's just mine it for particular tokens. This is what sentiment analysis does. Let's look at nouns. Let's look at adjectives, and let's throw the rest of the sentence, the rest of the speech act on the floor. But out there in the technology markets, a group of people have been working for the better part of 2 decades on understanding how text is actually relational. Anybody in here doing anything in their IT infrastructure with triple store databases? With the semantic web, with RDF, with entity recognition? It is happening. It's happening everywhere in the commercial world, in the academic world, because it is, when all is said and done, pretty weak to throw most of the Speech Act on the floor. We want to understand what the relationship is between the subject and its attributes, between that subject and the direct object, what the attributes of that direct object are. We want to be able to read the Twitter stream or email threads or posts on particular boards and understand what the intent of the speakers are for reasons, among other things, having to do with national security. If you look at text, and here's one of my favorite examples. Look, for example, at the way people describe themselves in public forums. I made this one up, but it's not far wrong. We're first presented with just these blocks of words. But if you spend some time working with them, what you discover is they're extraordinarily rich. In this particular one, there are 27 distinct verifiable claims related to 12 organizations in 3 distinct industries. There are at least 5 explicitly named individuals, 6 occupational positions, 1 invention, 2 college degrees, 4 apparently significant awards, 1 formal professional certification encompassing 33 years of this person's life history. Linguistically, it's mostly noise, but the very fact that we can identify those, not just with our eyeballs and our wetware, but with software, makes the rise of relational text quite likely in the time frame. And we see this in a number of places, not least of which is the ways in which natural language processing are starting to penetrate those places in our market that tend to produce the next big thing. So this is one example. We look very closely at the projects that Apache chooses to promote as being likely of future trends because they are a taste-making organization and they have the ability to coalesce divergent work into a single project. So we see relational text and the treatment of text in the same technical infrastructure as we deal with tuples today as being a highly likely outcome by 2020. California visualization. So there'll be a lot of talk, I think, over the next few days about visualization. It's a hot topic in the market. We have, for a variety of reasons, the ability to visualize data in new and exciting ways. I was just at a conference a few weeks back in which one of the vendors had chosen to paper the walls of a hallway with these incredibly beautiful data visualizations. It was like going to an art museum. I just wandered up and down the hall, looking at these pictures, sort of letting them flow over me. Trouble is, I couldn't tell you what any of them meant. They were extraordinarily beautiful, but their expressiveness was very low. And I think we've forgotten in the beautiful data movement that visualization is supposed to be economically expressive rather than beautiful per se. But that is changing as well. We know that large data sets that have complex interrelationships can only be watched or played. And our projection is that industries that today have very little to do with us, the entertainment industry, the gaming industry, are actually going to become quite deeply involved in our domain between now and the end of this decade. Visualization, California style. What does this look like? Well, here's an example. This is work by James Grant. This application is known as STOC, S-T-O-C. Has anyone ever seen this or played with it? So when you pull the deck, I've provided you with the URL. You can go and look at it. You can download a copy. You can listen to James Grant talk about his own work. But this is a visualization of the stock market because the folks with the most experience visualizing complex data sets in their interrelationship are the financial services folks. They've been doing it for a very long time. In this case, he's chosen to use a solar system metaphor, and when you look at it live, all of the equities that are being tracked are circling this central sun at a particular distance with a particular halo. And he's attempting to demonstrate, if memory serves, 12 dimensions of information about every object on the screen at the same time. That is, of course, what games do very well, is show us more than 2 dimensions of information on the screen in a way that has a very low impedance mismatch with our brains. The other example would be Maxis Systems Metaphor Mixer. Has anyone ever seen this application? This one is truly bleeding edge, but it tells us a lot about what the future looks like. Also a financial services application, and it's been used in the equity markets, it's been used in foreign exchange. In this market, in this application, you actually play the game. So if we were trading currency, for example, we would see our current position in particular currencies on the screen. We would fly over a wireframe map of the globe. Everywhere where there was an open currency market, we would see the kind of light that you see from space in dense urban environments. You can fly into a currency market. You can see all of the currencies that are being traded, and we know exactly which currencies are hot because they're high above the field, and they're red, and they're bouncing up and down. And when we want to get out of bot and into Hulden, all we have to do is fire a profit missile. It takes the very arcane art of currency trading and turns it into something that a 12-year-old can play, a game in which your ability to spot an opportunity and execute on it very rapidly is the essence of success, which indeed is the case with currency markets. This is not the kind of visualization that any of us are used to. We're not going to have to, as the early adopters have had to do, build this from scratch. The gaming industry and the open source game engine community are extraordinarily interested in figuring out how to integrate what they have built with what we have built. It's beginning to happen right now. It requires very complicated infrastructure that's far more complicated than that which we deal today. This happens to be a partial view of some of the infrastructure for an application made by a company called Palantir. Anybody worked with Palantir? Palantir used to be software that was used really only by people in national security disciplines. Over the last few years, it has been dragged in significant volume into commercial firms to deal with market intelligence and risk management problems. It is extraordinarily good at most of the things that we've already talked about. Integrating diverse sources, dealing with visualization, which is not fundamentally reducible to pie charts and line graphs, and fundamentally handling text in a relational way, because of course these are all the sorts of problems that you'd expect security analysts to have to deal with on a regular basis. So not only do we get silos, but we get increasingly complicated infrastructure. Decision management. Anybody in this room willing to fess up to their ongoing concern that our beautiful BI infrastructure delivers information to people who, in their turn, do nothing of value for the business? Anybody willing to fess up to this? This has been a burning hole in the pit of my stomach for as long as I've been in the business. We can build these beautiful information distribution environments that take incredibly complex data sets, model them well, mark them out to particular constituencies, paper them over with truly beautiful dashboards. But if I stand behind the consumer, asking myself the question, what are they doing with this? It's extraordinarily difficult to come up with a concrete answer. They are informing themselves. They are preparing presentations. They are building spreadsheets. They are making more data, but it's not clear in most cases that they're adding value to the business. It's not clear that decisions are being made. Now, we aren't generally given license to do the modern day equivalent of time and motion studies and actually follow our consumers around to see what they do with what we give them. And it's a shame, we ought to be. But the notion that we spend a lot of money on business intelligence and maybe haven't delivered a lot of value to the business is pretty prevalent, right? Periodically, people will point this out. There'll be a flurry of commentary on it. Everyone will agree that there's a problem, and then we all sort of agree to forget about it and keep on doing what we're doing. But one of the things that Hadoop and other technologies associated with the big data revolution have really put in front of us in a way that I don't think we're going to be able to ignore is that there is a strong algorithmic component to what we do. In big data, it's obvious that we have to process the data in order to produce sense, in order to make meaning. We accept that. If it's algorithmic, it belongs in code. This is one of the premises of the big data revolution, and it's going to impact us in significant ways. And I think what we're going to be in the business of by the end of this decade is not what I'll refer to here as factual decisions, also known as queries. How many widgets did we sell last month in the classic vernacular? But interpretative decisions. And within those two classes of interpretative decision, tractable ones, which can be addressed via algorithms and therefore belong in code, and intractable decisions, decisions that require heuristics and judgment that in essence are decisions that can only be made by the wetware analog computers that we carry around in our brains. And our business over time is going to be to figure out which of those are truly intractable, that are essentially heuristic, and that we have to continue to support with increasingly good visualization, more and more data, and what have you, and which of them are really tractable decisions that can, when we start to study them, be reduced to algorithms and therefore executed in code. This is very closely linked to the decline in eyeball feeding and the change in visualization. You can start to look at these kinds of things now in your own organization. We tend to focus, in a lot of cases in our BI environments, on purely factual decisions. Is Acme a customer of ours or not? Although that seems a trivial decision, an amazingly large number of organizations have difficulty answering basic questions like, have we done business with this company in the past or not? And if so, what sort of business? When what we really ought to be doing is working up in the upper right-hand corner. We should extend Acme the credit they ask for if and only if they threaten to take their business elsewhere if we do not extend them the credit. Because we should be about high complexity, high control oriented decisions. Unfortunately, for a variety of non-technical reasons, we've been focused on low complexity, low control, and therefore low value. This is going to change. It won't be a choice we make. We will be driven to it because technology will be able to handle a lot of the stuff in the lower left-hand corner of the diagram. Now, let's switch gears. This topic may seem irrelevant to you. I'm going to argue that it's going to be the biggest problem we will be discussing when we meet in a room like this 5 years from now. Privacy, copyrights, and patents. The basics of intellectual capital, intellectual property, the basics of our legal regime are all falling apart. Anybody here feel like they have any reasonable control over what other people know about them? Good answer. Anybody believe that any political regime anywhere in the world will be able to give them back something they have already lost? Excellent answer. Our information, details about our behavior, are bleeding into the public domain at the highest rate they ever have. And it's not simply because Barnes & Noble or TJ Maxx or anybody else gets hacked, not because someone gets a hold of some significant percentage of the user account information for LinkedIn, or because the new devices we carry around with us are even less secure than the old devices we used to depend on. It's that everything is connected to everything. And there is this fundamental rule about technology, which is that the cost of dismantling any security infrastructure is an order of magnitude lower than the cost of building it, right? In the extreme case, this would be the 14-year-old kid in Germany who defeated a $500 million CD protection scheme developed over years by Sony by deploying a sticky note and a Sharpie. Put the sticky note across the CD, drag the Sharpie across the outside track that contains the privacy information, and you've defeated the entire system. AT&T, other providers, the guys who are obvious targets from the perspective of our legal regime, they're being pressured in various ways to uphold the existing regime, and they're responding by passing this on to us. So has anybody clicked through this particular thing recently? Basically what this says is, if you do something wrong, we're going to help people come and get you, because we can't stop it. Right? The US has now admitted, in my view, in practice, that the patent regime is unworkable. The notion that the government would ex post facto kind of say we should never have awarded this patent to begin with is pretty compelling evidence that in terms of IP protections, patents aren't worth very much anymore. And I think it all comes down to bodies like this. We elect these people, but we do not elect them for their technical perspicacity, do we? These are, after all, people who don't understand that when you take a photograph of yourself nude and tweet it, other people can see it. We're moving into a world that I think we ought to be referring to as the world of reputation management. We're in the early days, and so when people like the Pew organization ask us questions about what we believe about our transparency, we tend to give them answers that, in aggregate at least, suggest that we don't really understand just how transparent we are. We know that organizations are starting to become interested in reputation management. This is one of the primary places in which sentiment analysis and the beginnings of the relational text revolution are starting to show up. Organizations are spending significant amounts of time paying attention to what is being said about them. Why? Because they can, because technology makes it possible. Meanwhile, there is a public records data marketplace. Organizations that are extraordinarily well-funded and have a perspective on big data that we will not have for another 5 years. These organizations are collecting every public record on every human being in every interesting economy all over the world. And they are putting all of that information together, and they are putting powerful next-generation relational text and visualization technologies on top of that data, and they are telling people who are willing to pay an extraordinary amount about anyone those people are interested in. And that's happening in the internet world as well. This is Rapleaf. Any of you in the consumer side of the industry work directly with Rapleaf? I encourage all of you to go to Rapleaf, put your own email addresses in there, and see what Rapleaf knows about you. I think you will be shocked. There is a reaction to this, and the reaction is something which is known in the trade as the personal data store movement. Anyone familiar with this term? You should get familiar with it. It's driven by a group of people who are going to turn out to be very important to us 36 to 48 months from now, the VRM movement, the Vendor Relationship Management movement. These are a group of people who said, hey, corporations, they have CRM systems. They can interpolate us as consumers 8 ways from Sunday. We need The same system for consumers. We need to control our own information and license it in appropriate ways to organizations at appropriate times. They have a manifesto written by a very famous information technology theorist, Doc Searles, called The Intention Economy. If you only read one book that doesn't have data warehouse in the title this year, read this book. It is an extraordinarily robust scenario planning exercise by a very intelligent individual. The VRM movement is going to create a world, if it can, in which each of us has control over our own personal information that we broker to one another and to the various organizations that provide us with goods and services in a controlled and perhaps contractual manner. It's a very interesting idea about rights in data. Voluntary syndication. I give Amazon information about me in exchange for value received from Amazon. Vendors that do not deliver value to me do not get information from me. For some of us who work in organizations that depend on ignorance in the consumer, this revolution, if it accrues, could break much of the analytics work we're doing now. So, to summarize my stories into a master story, we project for our clients an environment in which a new technology ensemble surrounds the traditional data warehouse, does not replace it, surrounds it. That new environment is siloed with a lot of for-purpose appliances appearing in the architecture, and exploration and discovery are raised to the status of information distribution. We spend as much or more money on exploration and discovery than we do on information distribution. Analytics get fat. They feed machines as well as eyeballs. Textual analytics becomes more important than tuple-based analytics. Visualization focuses on the truly wicked problems, not on those that can be rendered algorithmic and connected to machines, because more and more routine decisions are fully automated, and more FYI information distribution can't be cost justified. If we don't go and look at what those folks are doing with those pie charts, someone else will, and they'll come to the conclusion that many of us have already come to in our guts: there isn't any business value here. Privacy gives way to wars of control. Whose data is it anyway? And the notion of rights in data, of multiple organizations and individuals having some rights to a particular data element, becomes dominant and requires corporations to manage their own data in that respect. So, you may be in a world in which there are still crystal balls and you can prognosticate, or you may have made the transition to a world in which the future is about storytelling. But in a market where signals arise primarily from the actions of other players, any dominant narrative about the future state of the market is likely to be accurate. That's the rule. The dominant story is likely to accrue. So if you're not orchestrating this kind of storytelling in your organization, you can still predict the future by listening to the stories that are being told in forums like this. Because the other half of the rule is the story you tell is a story that you wish to become true. And that's my shtick. Thanks, you've been very patient.
Thank you, Mark. And I don't know what happened to you, but you actually finished right on time.
Woo-woo!
That's never happened.
Never happened.
Thank you very much. Very informative. Remember, classes start tomorrow at 8. If you're in the forum, it's right next door. The classes wrap around us, and there's some back in Coral, which is back by the reception desk. So enjoy the next 5 days and get a lot of learning and a lot of networking. Thank you very much.